What if John D. Rockefeller didn't become the richest man in history just because he sold oil? What if the oil was just a bait? What if the real empire, the one still shaping your rent, your debt, your job security, wasn't built in refineries, but inside the financial plumbing of Wall Street? Because here's the uncomfortable truth: oil made Rockefeller rich, but finance made Rockefeller untouchable. And the consequences of that shift, you're living with them right now. Inflation that never fully goes away, debt that grows faster than wages, markets that seem to crash upward for the rich and downward for everyone else. So let me ask you a dangerous question. What if the modern Wall Street system, the one that privatizes gains and socializes losses, didn't just evolve naturally, but was engineered over a century ago? Not through laws, not through elections, but through the control of credit, trust structures, and banking power so complex, most people never even see it. Before we go any further, a quick community check-in. Where are you watching from? Drop your country or city in the comments. This channel is global for a reason, and if you're tired of sanitized history and approved economics, subscribe now. Because here, we talk about the unfiltered truth, the version that makes powerful people very uncomfortable. Now let's rewind the clock. Not to the oil wells, not to the factories, but to the moment Rockefeller realized something most industrialists never did: whoever controls credit, controls the future. Official history paints John D. Rockefeller as a ruthless but brilliant industrialist. Standard Oil, vertical integration, railroad discounts, market efficiency. That's the textbook version, but here's what the textbooks gloss over. Rockefeller didn't stop at controlling oil. He converted his industrial dominance into financial dominance, and then locked it all behind institutions that still exist today. In the late 1800s, America had a problem. Too many banks, too little regulation, and frequent panics. Sound familiar? Back then, banks failed constantly. Credit dried up overnight. Workers lost everything, while financiers consolidated assets for pennies on the dollar. Rockefeller watched this chaos very closely, and he learned. By the 1890s, he understood a brutal truth: factories could be seized, railroads could be regulated. But financial structures, if designed correctly, could survive governments, public outrage, and even antitrust laws. He began shifting his strategy, not away from oil, but above it. He moved his wealth into trusts, holding companies, and private banks. These were structures designed not to produce goods, but to control the flow of capital itself. This was revolutionary. Instead of owning companies directly, Rockefeller interests now own the financing behind the companies. If a firm needed money for expansion, Rockefeller Capital decided. If a competitor struggled during a downturn, Rockefeller-aligned banks decided who lived and who died. Sound familiar? Then came 1907. A massive financial panic nearly collapsed the entire US banking system. And who stepped in as the unofficial central bank? J.P. Morgan, working closely with Rockefeller-linked capital. Private financiers stabilized the system, not the government, not the voters, not Congress. The lesson was crystal clear. Wall Street couldn't be left unstable, because that instability threatened the power of the elite. So they did something extraordinary. They helped create the Federal Reserve in 1913. It was sold to the public as protection against financial panics, but it was structured in a way that private banks dominated regional control. Here's the parallel that matters so much today. Just like back then, crises weren't eliminated, they were managed. Panics became opportunities, instability became leverage. And financial elites learned how to turn economic collapses into consolidation events where they could scoop up even more power. Rockefeller didn't just adapt to this system, he helped shape it. And once credit became centralized, abstract, and disconnected from actual production, power shifted permanently. It moved from the workers to the financiers, from industries to balance sheets, from visible monopolies to invisible control. But the most important move was still ahead. Because the real empire wasn't oil, it wasn't even banking. It was the idea that money itself could be managed, expanded, contracted, and redirected, all without public consent, and that idea would explode Wall Street into something far bigger than Rockefeller could have ever publicly owned. This is where the story takes a sharp turn. Rockefeller didn't try to own all of Wall Street. He did something far smarter. He embedded his influence into the very architecture of finance itself. The key mechanism, private credit creation combined with trust-based ownership, all protected by central banking policy. This allowed Rockefeller wealth to operate invisibly. Instead of seeing his name in headlines or on buildings, instead of public ownership, the real power moved into correspondent banking networks, investment trusts, interlocking directorates, and philanthropic foundations that could shape public policy. He created banks that didn't just lend money. They decided who got access to money in the first place. And once money became credit-based rather than asset-based, control became exponential. One decision at the top could expand or contract entire sectors of the economy. A tightening of credit could crush competitors, while a loosening could inflate allies. And here's the chilling part. This system didn't die with Rockefeller. It became the blueprint. Every major Wall Street institution today still uses this exact model: private risk, public backstops, opaque structures, and moral hazard baked right into the system. But the final twist, Rockefeller-linked institutions weren't just shaping markets. They were shaping policy, education, economics, public health, and monetary theory. By the mid-20th century, the line between finance, government, and academia had blurred completely. And when you see the name of the institution that quietly unified all these forces, you won't believe it, because the receipt is wilder than you think. Have you ever wondered how the world really works? Not the version you see on the news, but the hidden mechanics of power and money. Let's peel back the layers, cleanly and clearly. Without the mystique. It starts with a simple, brutal truth. Credit is power, today. Money isn't gold. It's not even the paper in your wallet. It's credit, and credit is created when banks lend. John D. Rockefeller understood this a century ago. He realized that controlling the lenders meant controlling the entire engine of economic growth. Think about this. By the early 1900s, banks aligned with Rockefeller influenced billions in lending. This was at a time when the entire US GDP was under $40 billion. That's an almost unimaginable level of leverage. But leverage is a double-edged sword. It only works if the losses don't wipe you out. So, the system was engineered from the very beginning to externalize risk, to push it away from the center and onto someone else. How do you maintain that kind of control? Especially when the public starts to get suspicious. You use what are called trust structures. These allowed the Rockefeller wealth to operate in the shadows. They could avoid direct ownership, which meant they could sidestep antitrust actions. They operated through layers upon layers of intermediaries. So, when new regulations eventually came, the actual power never moved. It just stayed hidden. Today, we see the same playbook, just with different language. We call them asset managers, custodians, shell entities, and off-balance sheet vehicles. The strategy is identical. Then came the masterstroke, central banking. The creation of the Federal Reserve in 1913 wasn't about eliminating financial crises. It was about managing them. And smoothing out volatility doesn't actually remove risk. It just encourages people to take on more of it. This is what economists call moral hazard. If you know you'll be bailed out, you'll make riskier bets. By the 1920s, this massive expansion of credit fueled enormous asset bubbles. And in 1929, the whole thing came crashing down. But what was the response? Was it to decentralize? To give power back to the people? No. The response was more centralization, more institutional power, and creating an even greater distance between the creation of money and the public who had to use it. Let's ground this in some cold, hard facts. At its peak, the Rockefeller family's wealth was estimated to be around $400 billion in today's money. By 1913, the year the Fed was created, private banks controlled over 70% of all credit issuance in the United States, and the Fed's balance sheet back then, zero. Today, it's over $7 trillion. Look at the financial sector's share of corporate profits. In the 1950s, it was about 10%. Right before the 2008 crisis, it was over 30%. This isn't random. This isn't accidental growth. This is the result of systemic design. And this design has a profound consequence. When finance becomes the dominant force in an economy, actual production becomes secondary. Companies stop focusing on innovation and start focusing on financial engineering. They don't create new jobs. They focus on boosting their margins through stock buybacks and debt. And the risk doesn't just disappear. It migrates. It moves into our pension funds, onto the balance sheets of households, and onto the books of governments. And when the inevitable collapse comes, who gets saved? The system gets a flood of liquidity. The people who took the risk are bailed out. The public, who bore the consequences, is left holding the bag. This brings us to Rockefeller's true, permanent legacy. It isn't oil. It's the creation of a world where the financial elites don't need to own everything outright. They just need to control who gets funded. That is the trillion-dollar empire of Wall Street. It never went away. It just evolved. Here's the final, chilling truth. Rockefeller didn't just win at capitalism. He rewired its very DNA. He was instrumental in moving power away from visible monopolies, like his Standard Oil, and into invisible systems of finance. In these systems, accountability fades away, and influence compounds silently, generation after generation. And today, that system is faster, more global, and far more fragile than ever before. Credit moves at the speed of light. Crises spread across the globe in an instant, and the very same types of institutions still sit at the heart of it all, insulated by complexity, protected by policy, and rescued by design. The most dangerous currency in this world is denial, because systems that are built on borrowed time always collapse. They just collapse onto someone else. The public is constantly told to trust the institutions, to believe in the promise of stability, and to accept wild market swings as just normal volatility. But history whispers a very different warning. When finance divorces itself from reality, when elites control the flow of credit without any accountability, collapse is not just a possibility, it becomes a predictable phase in the cycle. So here's your call to action. Share this video with someone who still believes that Wall Street's immense power is just an accident of history. Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Challenge this narrative. Let's have a real conversation. And if you want more deep dives into how the past quietly shapes your future, make sure you subscribe. Because the real question isn't about Rockefeller anymore. It's about us. Are we any wiser now? Or are we just walking the same old path, but in better suits?